So the New York Times published a piece going into the putsch attempt by Trump or the Trump administration and other Republicans that were basically on board with that attempt to overturn the government. And so in the piece at the New York Times, as they're going through basically the 77 days, and they're talking about behind the scenes, they're talking about the relationships with the various people that were involved. And one of the most interesting people is McConnell. Now, think back for a moment. When Trump, the day election night, Trump comes out first thing in the morning, like early, like I forget the time, and basically makes the point that this election was ensconced with fraud. That not only did I not lose this election, but I won it in a landslide, which is pretty astonishing, right? It's one thing to say that you won it. It's another thing to say that you won it in a landslide, even though it's not necessarily available for you to see that you won it in a landslide. And you get to this kind of weird situation where many people, this is taboo, right? It's not necessarily something people do, but Donald Trump had said in advance that the only way this election can go out is if I win. And if I lose it, then I was cheated, which told you pretty much everything that you should expect at the end of this election. And Trump, true to form, did just that. And in the open, broad daylight, basically, comically, incompetently, but still seriously tried to overthrow the U.S. government. Now, some people could say the putsch attempt was comical. Some people could say they were incompetent. Some people could say it was bumbling and everything else. That doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, the president of the United States, in bad faith, refused to accept the election results, had all the agency in the world to bring up case after case after case after case, and basically boiled down to screaming that the communists were working with the governor of Georgia, who was a Trump supporter, in order, and the CIA, in order to overturn the election for one President Biden. And despite Trump going around the world or going around the country saying this stuff, when it boils down to brass tacks of being able to show and demonstrate in a court of law, Trump couldn't do it. And he would continuously scream voter fraud, while simultaneously not able to present or show the voter fraud. And so without anything to base this on, you're stuck with this thing of, if you did win, you need to show the evidence. Now, many of the Democrats, of course, were howling bloody murder at this. And like I said, my position on this was there's nothing wrong with the president or any other politician challenging an election results in good faith. The problem with this one was, I don't believe for a moment it was good faith. Donald Trump just didn't want to leave, and the humiliation of leaving was too much for him to bear, as opposed to overturning the election result in and of itself. The interesting question is, what about Republicans? What about Congress? If you notice, whereas Democrats were howling bloody murder, you had a few Republicans, I believe around 14 of them, led by Ted Cruz and there was one other gentleman. But it was about 14 of them that were going to back Donald Trump up in the Senate. That basically were going to say, yes, we say that there's a problem with this particular election, and have a debate over that very specific point. The idea being, again, to throw the election into this kind of turmoil. Many of the other Republicans, though, were mum. They were mum. If you notice, they were very quiet. Donald Trump was screaming about election fraud and screaming about being cheated and screaming about the communists and screaming about Maduro, screaming about all of these things. And many of the Republicans were very hushed. They were very mum. And the point I was trying to make to people is that the reason that they're mum is because, one, they want to win the Georgia elections, so they don't necessarily want to antagonize Trump in lieu of that. But just as important, I would imagine, for Mitch McConnell, is he didn't want to split his party. Now, understand what I mean by that. If we're talking about, let's say, the Senate or the House, and we're seeing there's certain members who broke down as Trumpers and others who broke down as classical Republicans. Many of the classical Republicans, let's say the Grahams of the world, or for that matter, the Mitch McConnells of the world, John McCain's of the world, they didn't necessarily want to get on Trump's bad side, especially if they were dependent upon getting elected and you needed that support base to get elected. Ted Cruz never one to miss an opportunity to be theatrical in his politics, or let's say to work in his own self-interest, decides to basically jump in and back up Trump on this, arguing on Trump's behalf. McConnell kept his mouth shut. McConnell kept his mouth shut. Like I said, he wanted to take the Senate. He didn't want to create an issue with Trump in that. And so the question now becomes, what is the excuse that McConnell is using to justify letting this go for as long as it went? Now, that's the part that gets funny. Because the New York Times, McConnell is one of the most cynical men in politics. And yet, McConnell is like, I was duped. I was tricked. Trump, they kept telling me that he was not trying to do this and that this was just bellicosity. And McConnell is basically saying, I was tricked and duped by Donald Trump and his administration. Was Mitch McConnell duped? One of the most cynical men on the planet. Was Mitch McConnell actually duped? I mean, this is the guy who said he was going to make Obama a one-term president. This is the guy that basically made an argument once that said Obamacare doesn't even cover everybody. As if it did, he would back it, which of course he still would not have backed it. I mean, this is also the one that famously, my goal is to make Obama a one-term president. Oh, right, and Merrick Garland. Not bringing up Merrick Garland for a vote, despite the fact that it was Obama's pick. I'm making the point that this cynical SOB, we're supposed to believe that Donald Trump, or he believed Donald Trump, and that this had nothing to do with the incentives that were built into this process. That, nope, I was just duped. I don't buy that for a minute. Mitch McConnell wasn't duped. Mitch McConnell was playing politics, and he knew where his bread was buttered. That bread was buttered by backing Donald Trump. And fact of the matter is, there was no way for him to break with Donald Trump immediately without any kind of political fallout. McConnell knew that, so McConnell didn't do it. And so the strongest position that McConnell could take at the time was silence. Silence. Think back to Elizabeth Warren for a moment to show you something on the Democrat side. If you were looking at Sanders when he was running in 2016, if you remember, Sanders tried to get Warren to run at one point. Warren turned Sanders down. Sanders, therefore, ran. The question became, if indeed Warren is supposed to be the second most populist or second most progressive, I would imagine we don't necessarily believe that now. People don't believe that now anymore. But if she was indeed supposed to be the second most progressive person in Congress, why wouldn't she back Sanders? Now, that question assumes that the person is an ideological actor as opposed to basically looking out for their own self-interest, a weather vane, which what she was. But if you remember, she had an agreement with Hillary Clinton going back to 2013, her and the other women Democrats in the Senate. Hillary Clinton got this because she was concerned that Elizabeth Warren would run and that her chances would be hurt if another female ran that, let's say, was far, far more likable than Clinton. And so what ends up happening was she signs that document. Now, this means that Elizabeth Warren will be backing Hillary Clinton regardless. All of the talk, all of the consternation, all of the questions, all of the people asking and everything else, all of the bated breath, wondering when is Elizabeth Warren going to back Sanders that year? No. The reality of it is the strongest position that Elizabeth Warren could take, at least in her head, because she had basically signed on a dotted line, was basically silence. I'm saying the same thing is true here. Mitch McConnell has certain political, let's say, incentives that went into that process to keep his mouth shut. That, however, is not what Mitch McConnell is saying in this document. Mitch McConnell is going with the idea that Trump suckered him. Don't buy it at all. Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, and subscribe. You can always support this content through PayPal or Patreon. This video is not going to be long, but I thought this one, reading between the lines, the segment, let's say it that way. So this is the New York Times, 77 days. Now, this goes into the insight into 77 days. Trump campaign to subvert the election. And this goes basically into the behind-the-scenes stuff. I want to get to Mitch McConnell's topics. So, right here. as he sought the president's right. Mitch McConnell wanted help from Trump in Georgia, because after all, 2 seats were up for grabs. And those 2 seats that were up for grabs, if McConnell loses both, he loses control of the Senate. He knows that. He does not want to lose control of the Senate. So what does he do? He goes quiet. And by going quiet, he's given a certain amount of room to Trump to run. Meaning, if McConnell came out and put a knife in Trump as soon as that election was over with, it becomes far harder for Trump to make that case, especially for the other Republicans that are in the constituency that would probably, or most likely, or potentially follow McConnell's lead, especially with him being somewhat of a strong voice in that center. The problem is McConnell can't do this. If McConnell does this, he's concerned that it would split the vote in Georgia. Keep in mind, Republicans have multiple people to vote for. This is not the left where you have nowhere else to go. They can always vote for somebody else, or they can always stay out of it. They're not necessarily adversely affected by it, talking about Republicans, whether they do so or not, if indeed they would otherwise vote for a Republican. So McConnell is in somewhat of a box. If I go after Trump right now, if I say no to this, and keep in mind, there is no way, I believe, for a moment that McConnell was okay with Donald Trump doing this. This was very taboo. The system that allowed McConnell to get in office and to stay in office and accrue power in that office was being basically undermined by Trump. So this is not a situation that McConnell would have ever liked this from an ideological standpoint. However, the ideology doesn't matter, or at the very least matters less. The winning, the end result for McConnell mattered more. And so, yeah, and in the phone calls with Donald Trump, these guys apparently, after the election, were in communications over the course of the days after the vote. And what they're trying to say is that McConnell was never really confronted by Trump. Meaning Trump never went after McConnell, because I think on some level Trump also understood that if McConnell comes out against me, it makes my situation that much more difficult. It's not so much that he had the alignment of the Republican Party backing him on it. He just had enough of them to shut up, to give him running room on that very specific point. So for all of those days when he was basically trying to push the various people to do stuff that they didn't have the authority to do, to try to get various members in other states to overturn the election results, to try to get judges to overturn the election results, despite doing all of that, and doing all of that in the open where people could basically see it, he was able to do it because McConnell, on some level, gave him running room to do it. It was both were getting something out of it. What happens? Trump, angry, pissed off, because to him, he believes that many of the other Republicans should be backing him up on this nonsense of his election being stolen by the communists. And on top of that, the people that stuck by him, the Mitch McConnells of the world, the Mike Pences of the world, well, those people became far more, let's say Trump became far more angry at those people, because those people wouldn't necessarily toe his line to keep him in office. Trump comes out and says $2,000 stimulus. McConnell doesn't want to deal with the $2,000 stimulus. Biden, Warnock, Ossoff, they all say, we're going to send you $2,000 checks if you put me in office. They put him in office and they reneged on the checks. But the key point there is they put him in the office. McConnell loses his position, loses power in that particular position, and Biden takes the Senate. At that point, there is no reason for McConnell to engage in this farce that Donald Trump somehow won the election. And one Republican after the next begin to come out in this kind of trickle of basically going after and saying Biden won and congratulating Joe Biden. The thing that I want to point to here is the idea that cynical Mitch McConnell believed Trump on this. He's saying, I believe Meadows. I believe the Christianers of the world. I believe these people who are part of the Trump administration, who is telling me that he doesn't really believe it. He's just being bellicose. I know it seems like he's out there trying to overturn the election. And I know he's making those phone calls. And I know he's making those runs at the various members in the various states. I know he's doing that. But don't believe your eyes. Nothing to see here. Entirely optics. Did McConnell really believe it was optics? Did McConnell really believe it was optics? Do you honestly believe that Mitch McConnell believed it was optics, or did McConnell just not care? did the political issue for McConnell matter more? And mattered more in a way where there was no good faith belief that Donald Trump would ever be able to overturn the election. And so from McConnell's standpoint, it's a political calculation, a political wager of whether I let this guy run, knowing that if I do anything to inhibit that run in the intervening time, I could make my situation worse. And while allowing him to basically run, he has no capacity to overturn the election. So the run in and of itself is not going to be deleterious to the political space. I hope that makes sense. I'm trying to make this point that McConnell very well probably didn't believe that Donald Trump would have the capacity to overturn the election, allowing him a certain degree of leeway until allowing Trump to basically to run, because McConnell wanted to get Georgia. Now, this could go two ways. You can make a case that said McConnell didn't care, or you can make a case that said McConnell didn't know, but thought on the wager of it all, Trump wasn't going to be able to do it. Whichever one of those you want to go with, they still boil down to the exact same thing, that McConnell probably, at least I don't believe for a moment, had a good faith belief that Donald Trump won that election or was cheated in that particular election. And from his standpoint, if he allowed Trump leeway, he had to do it for a reason. What was the reason? And was it really because he was tricked? I don't believe McConnell was tricked. I don't believe it. I don't buy it. I don't believe that cynical SOB was tricked. No, I think it really does boil down to the way I'm explaining it. I really do think it boils down to McConnell needed a political favor from Trump. Help us get Georgia. You don't have to state that overtly. You just have to know that. Everybody knows McConnell wants Georgia. Everybody knows Trump wants to overturn the election. I'll shut up about your election if you help me get Georgia. Deal. I'm not saying that's what took place in regards to handshake. I'm just making the point that that's basically what was taking place in the grand scheme of the context. Because I don't believe for a moment McConnell was tricked. I could be wrong. But McConnell is an old dog in politics. And I don't believe that old dog got conned by Trump. Nope. I think it was worse than that. I think McConnell knew Trump was lying. And I think on top of him knowing Trump was lying, the damage to the political space for Donald Trump trying to foment a coup or by a president basically attacking the political space in and of itself mattered less to McConnell than taking the Senate. Or for that matter, keeping the party together. So yeah, I don't buy this notion that McConnell was a sucker in this. So I'm not going to keep this long. This one wasn't meant to be long. It was just kind of a heads up on what was going on in the conversation that was taking place, especially around the story from the New York Times. It's trending, and I thought it was actually pretty interesting. But no. McConnell is not Pollyannish in any stretch of the word. And if he has been around politics enough where I would imagine he understands the quantity on some level of what Trump is. And if a man understands the quantity of what Trump is based on the actions that Trump had took prior, and for that matter, even things that Trump himself had said, then why would he believe it? I would argue he didn't. Like, share.